So, is there life after philosophy? I'm interviewing philosophy majors years after graduation. Let's hear what they have to say. I'm Christopher Anadale. Welcome back to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Makala Harrison. She's a 2024 graduate of Mount St. Mary's University with a double major in philosophy and environmental science. She is currently a student in the Master's in Entomology program at the University of Maryland, where she also does research and teaching in entomology. For people who don't know the vocabulary, that's bug science. Makala, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you again. You were graduated from the Mount last year. I remember that you were in my senior seminar, the fall of your senior year. We read MacIntyre and Ethics and the Problems of Modernity, right? And you've since gone on into a science program from a science and philosophy double major. So it's one of the things that I'm really interested in to hear about from you is what's it look like, not just from the student perspective as an undergraduate, but as now a graduate student in the sciences. How do you think about philosophy and your philosophy education now?
Well, one of the things that I think has been most helpful is when you're doing philosophy coursework, it's not just the subject or like the thinkers that you're learning about. There's a lot of other skills that kind of come into play. So skills that help you in all sorts of areas of your life, especially with academics and critical thinking. You're really able to think about your beliefs and critique those. And, you know, sometimes you come into the situation where you realize you don't believe what you actually think that you did.
Right.
So being able to think through that kind of phenomenon is really special. And I think you don't really get to do that if you don't have that kind of philosophy training.
That sounds very much like one of the problems we confronted when working through MacIntyre a year and a half ago.
Right.
Right. Is there a way it's especially relevant to sciences, or is just sort of an overall life attitude that you feel like you carried with you?
I think in sciences, you kind of fall into like a rut of thinking the same way everyone else does. You know, it can kind of turn into this big rat race almost. Like with academics in science, it's like you're trying to publish, you're trying to be productive in a sense where only results that have some sort of like significant meaning are really proving to be productive. So in philosophy, you learn that knowledge is good, like the world is good and you are good. So I think keeping that in mind has helped me a lot, especially when you're going through projects that don't really turn out the way that you were hoping they would.
Yeah. Let me ask this as somebody who knows nothing whatever about science and how it's practiced now in the contemporary academy or in the laboratory. What does people are going to ask themselves? I can visualize what a scientist does, whether it's with test tubes and chemicals like in the old movies, or I'm working on a lab report, I'm controlling for these variables, I'm applying for this grant. I can sort of visualize that. Where does philosophy come into that then? Is it simply that the mind of Makala that you're using to do each of those tasks is a philosophical mind? Or is there something about the practices that you go through, which again, I know very little about, that might have a certain kind of character to it?
I think it can even come down to just what you're doing. A lot of times when you're designing an experiment or like writing a grant, you're trying to explain how it could like benefit either society as a whole or with entomology, there's a lot of focus on agriculture. How could my project affect farmers and agriculture as a whole? One of the things that I kind of gravitate more towards is just accumulating knowledge for knowledge's sake. Like right now, my main research project is revising a genus of harvestmen, so the daddy longlegs. Right now, in one of the families that's more prolific in North America, there's 4 species. My advisor and I are going to take that up to 13, I think.
Wow. Is this by finding them or just by discriminating more carefully among samples that you have?
Both. So
Okay.
my advisor had kind of inherited a very large collection of specimens where a lot of species are kind of grouped together because someone like didn't take their notes properly, or when you get into taxonomy, which is kind of assigning species,
Right.
you have people who want to group things together, people who really want to like make different species, subspecies. So you're kind of seeing how those species are different from each other, where you don't always have a very like strong purpose for doing that other than like just generating more knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I remember from years ago teaching a philosophy of science class, one of the issues that came up were different principles of taxonomy. Would you hold to an older system of classification based upon environmental variables, behavior, morphology, or would you use genetics to try to create maybe a completely new set of groupings? Is there one of those one of those or the other that dominates in entomology, or is there a kind of a competition between them?
It kind of depends.
Okay.
So there's some people who are really just into the like morphology, how these organisms are changing through time, or just different variations in the same species. Others are really in the camp of doing genetic analyses on everything, because it can tell you a lot of information. I think taxonomy based on just looking at morphology is kind of a dying art. It takes, I think, a special person to be stuck in their lab for hours on end with a microscope and saying, oh, on this species, it has little spikes here on the side. This
Okay.
species, it doesn't. What are some reasons for that? You know?
Well, it just occurred to me that because if you're dealing with insects, you're looking at a very short lifespan
Right.
compared to human beings, and so many, many generations possible. Not as many as with perhaps bacteria or algae, microscopic organisms, but is it a small enough cycle that enough generations can pass that you actually can see speciation or divergence or evolution happening in the populations you're looking at? Maybe my question is badly framed, but do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. You can definitely see different traits arising. One of the more interesting things, and one of the things that I focus on, is their reproductive systems. So it can be very difficult to tell species apart just from the outside. So you have to dissect them, and all of their genitals and their reproductive system is very different between species.
Okay.
And you can kind of see that starting to happen, even just over a few years or a few decades.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking that it's, in some ways, it's the human lifespan, or maybe the working lifespan of a scientist, a couple of decades, right? Maybe 4 or 5 decades, is your kind of frame of reference.
Right.
And then if you're looking at something like a redwood tree or a tortoise that far exceeds that, there's only so much you can know. And if you're looking at something like a bacterium or an insect with a very short lifespan, you're looking at it at a scale compared to yours that's vast. But all of that's in terms of what a human lifespan looks like. So let's think more about philosophy. And what does your philosophy education look like now in 1 year retrospect? You're into a science curriculum that you're not finished with yet. As a graduate student, you're looking forward, I presume, to a career in that area. Apart from the things you've spoken about already, what did you find to be valuable in what you studied before?
Yeah. So my introduction to philosophy was actually through you. I took my first philosophy class online over a summer.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
Because I didn't really think I would enjoy it. At that point, I didn't really know what philosophy was or why it was this required class that I had to take. So I'd gotten my textbooks delivered to me, and I was curious, so I started looking through. You were teaching on Boethius, and for whatever reason, that was the first book that kind of caught my eye, and I started reading it before the class. I finished it in, I guess, 2 days, so I just couldn't put it down.
Wow.
So that's when I realized, oh, there might be something here. I really enjoyed the class, and then I was taking them kind of out of order. So I I forget what it's called, but the third class in your, or ethics, that's what it was.
Right,
I took
the ethics
ethics
class,
of philosophy before that second core philosophy class.
Okay, that happens sometimes.
Right. And I just really fell in love with it. It was kind of an impulsive thing to add that, it started as a minor, and then I had to take a 5th year because of some scheduling conflicts. So I decided, what the heck, I'll make it a major. May as well. So I think just that impulsiveness and kind of just taking the classes that aligned with my interests most is still really carried over. So I'll often see philosophy books that might not have anything to do with like what I do at school or in my personal life, and I'm still reading them just because they've caught my eye.
That's great. And any particular one that comes to mind now?
I love existentialism.
Okay.
So Dr. Hersey here introduced me to that. So I love Sartre, Nietzsche. So things that I don't personally always agree with, but I just think are super interesting.
They can be some fascinating writers, I know for sure. That's great. Yeah. What some people will say, if you're going to major in philosophy, sort of that's the sort of a youth thing. That's a hobby. That's a side interest, or that's something you're passionate about, which can be good. But then there's also the practical side. So majoring in business or in science or whatnot. Is that the way it was with you?
I think it first started because it was just something I enjoyed. At first, I didn't really see much practical benefit to it. I think it was Dr. Hersey when I had first started talking about majoring. He was like, there's a lot of closeted philosophy lovers out there. And that was his terminology.
That's nice. I may borrow that. That's good.
And I remember thinking, you're kind of insane. There can't be that many people who are into this. And when I went to my interview for my master's degree, I walked into my now advisor's office, and there were philosophy books all over his bookshelf in his office.
Oh, wow.
And I remember thinking, I guess Dr. Hersey was right. And most of my interview, we were actually talking about, philosophy of science. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, so I guess there's plenty of interest out there. This is somebody who's in the sciences as well, right? But takes an interest in these things. Is there any way some of the philosophy you've studied has been present in your life? Anything that you've been able to do or to see that you thought you wouldn't have if you had taken a different path?
I've often thought about philosophy as a sort of therapy almost. As I think in my generation, especially, you can be very hopeless at times. There's a lot of people who are going around life doesn't really mean anything. But through philosophy, you get to the point where you realize that your being is good. You're good. So the fact that I exist is great. It's good at its core. And I don't know if that's something that I would have come to if it wasn't for my philosophy education. So it makes the difficult times that you go through not seem as bad. Graduate school especially can be very difficult at times.
I was about to say there's plenty of low moments, I know, in graduate study.
Yeah. It can be very lonely too. So I think just having that in the back of my mind that what I'm doing is good, knowledge is good, it's very helpful.
That's great. Some people would say that's an area that's more occupied by faith in their way of thinking, that people would draw consolation from religion while still doing whatever they're doing. Is there something particular to the intellectual profile of philosophy or being a philosopher that you think makes a difference?
I think in faith, I am a religious person. I think you can sometimes kind of psych yourself out of your own religion. You kind of get stuck in this sort of funk almost, where it's kind of hard to reason your way out of that. I think the tools that you get from philosophy definitely help. Philosophy and theology are definitely different. There's a lot of overlap there.
Right.
And I think when you have both, it's just a very powerful thing.
It's funny. I was actually just telling a class of high school students earlier this morning about book one of Consolation of Philosophy. And Boethius, in a sense, what Lady Philosophy is telling Boethius is, your problem is not a faith problem. It is, but it's not just that. It's a deeper philosophical problem, is that you're thinking in the wrong way. You've lost confidence in the power of reason, and you can't replace that with confidence in the power of God. You've got to sort of fix what's in your own house, what's inside first, and then you'll be in a fit position to recognize the rationality of the universe, the goodness of being, and the things that will ultimately console you, leading you towards the higher relationship with God. So, I did not know that you had read The Consolation before that first class.
Yeah.
That's a remarkable discovery. That's a fantastic book. It's so much fun to read and to teach, I know.
Yeah, and I think that was my very first introduction to philosophy at all.
Wow.
So I think that was a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. You mentioned your advisor as somebody who's one of these kind of, philosophers on the side, or somebody who's very interested in philosophy.
Right.
Have you met more? Is that a common type? Is it you think maybe a growing type among people, not just in the sciences, but perhaps other people you meet?
One thing I've noticed is that once people are introduced to philosophy, that's where it kind of skyrockets almost. So I'm wondering if there's like an access issue there, because it's not really something that's taught in public school, at least like high school, middle school. And a lot of colleges don't really put a lot of emphasis on it, especially the way that the Mount does. But I think most people who actually go into a philosophy class, that's where their interest really starts, and they realize that it is important.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is this sort of distributed kind of fraternity of people who've been affected by philosophy, sort of out in all areas, all walks of life. You have any expectation for that the kind of path you're envisioning for yourself in the future, as far as career or anything else goes, might be affected by the things you're carrying with you from your study of philosophy before?
Definitely in teaching. So I teach an introduction to ecology and evolution course, mostly freshmen, but occasionally upperclassmen fall in there too. And I definitely try and teach in a way that kind of encompasses my own philosophical formation. I know Aquinas has said quite a few things on teaching that I really like to take to heart. Like, when you're teaching, you're a facilitator for that student's journey into knowledge. So trying to understand that, I'm not just squawking at my students, trying to get them to understand, but actually trying to guide them down a path where they can be open to that knowledge, trying to be clear and concise in my instruction so that can happen. Yeah.
Do you find that you try to shape your students into a particular kind of philosophical awareness so that they can receive what you're trying to offer them? Or is that one of the things that you have to leave sort of beyond your reach? I
try. There is a lot of content that I have to get through. The class is kind of structured in a way where I can't really go off base too much. But I do try and introduce some philosophical topics to them, especially at the beginning. For example, in one of my first classes, we talk about the scientific method. So I actually teach them about Aristotle and how, his kind of, not scientific method per se, but how, knowledges come to, from an Aristotelian perspective.
It's fantastic.
And then we talk about Bacon and that kind of restructured method to getting to knowledge. And then we compare those two systems to the actual scientific method that's used today.
Oh, wow.
So that's one of my favorite classes.
How do students take to that? Because a lot of people come in with an idea that science is very simple.
Right.
You just look at what's there and then you write it down and you compare notes to make sure that you got it right.
Yeah. I get mainly two different types of responses. So I'll have the group of kids that just clocks out, where I realize I don't have their attention back until we talk about the actual scientific method. And then another group who's really just so interested in it and they had never heard anything like that before. Most of the time it's their first interaction with Aristotle. So I think just teaching them about how knowledge comes along and how it's historically come along to people is valuable. And hopefully that creates maybe a curiosity that they want to expand on more.
Mm-hmm. I've sometimes thought in my own teaching career that part of the role of the teacher is to embody a certain kind of wisdom, a certain kind of curiosity and self-knowledge and, willingness to take risks. Has that been your experience in your brief time as a teacher as well?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I think helps people the most is when their professor does have that kind of curiosity where, when you're teaching class, you are an expert in that topic. Like for me, I've been having classes in ecology and evolution for over 5 years. So none of the topics that I'm teaching are new to me, but there's still that love that I have for it that I try and broadcast to my students so that hopefully they pick up on it.
Yeah, I've sometimes wondered if part of the education a student gets, especially face-to-face in person with a good instructor, is even sort of subconsciously building a desire to imitate that person and the way that teacher appropriates and understands and thinks about. It's a bit like children learning manners or how to behave like an adult.
Right.
Is that you're thinking, okay, here's how to be a scientist, is what Makala is doing. And it's valuable, it's worthy, it's also got a lot of cultural coded elements to it that you have to pick up on. That's not that you won't learn from a book or from a lecture or from a review of your notes.
Right.
So it's a kind of what we call it, sort of mimesis and imitation, of the instructor, being a certain kind of person.
Right.
Reflecting on something you said earlier about the kind of the closeted philosophers out there in all different areas, in teaching in the academy and in science laboratories as well. Found myself thinking about the contrast between a type of education which is, we might say, kind of explicit or exoteric philosophy instruction. You take a philosophy course, you get your books, you read the Constellation of Philosophy, you write a paper in philosophy, etc. And then at places where there's not that institutional structure or commitment to a certain kind of philosophy education, you might have that same work done by people like you or your advisor, or the sort of the covert, army of philosophers out there who are doing what they're doing. They're teaching entomology, they're teaching accounting, marketing, whatever they're doing, but they're also conveying a certain kind of philosophical wisdom and worldview. Is that something you've seen manifest in your teaching or in the teaching of others in classes in which you're a student?
Yeah. So I do see it a lot in my own department in entomology. And it kind of throws me off sometimes because I've always been around other scientists who don't really have that background. And then you run into these covert philosophers, and there's kind of a moment of connection there. In one of my classes, we have a guest speaker who comes every Friday. So from all over the country, really. And each week, a different student in the class has to write a blog post, just summarizing that person's talk. And it goes on our department website. And I recently wrote one on a presentation someone did on ecological intensification, which I hate the definition of. But an example of ecological intensification would be like with Professor McGinley and his farm, lets his chicken and his sheep free roam. So they're fertilizing the ground, and he moves them throughout different locations on his fields. So doing that instead of artificially fertilizing is an example of ecological intensification.
Oh, I get it. Okay.
Yeah. So using nature's own processes to take over what man would normally do.
That's funny because initially you'd think maybe sometime 70 years ago we flipped it, right? We went from the old natural way to the new modern, sophisticated, efficient way of imposing a human solution, which is better, more intense, more controllable, etc.
And to me, that wouldn't need a definition. To me, that's just farming in accordance with what farming should be. But, in our blog post that we write for the department is not really, I feel, the place to go off on that. but the professor for the class reviews all of the blogs before they get posted. And one of the comments that he had left was, isn't this what people have been doing for thousands of years?
Right.
In response to me explaining what ecological intensification is. And I was just sitting there like, yes, why can't we just say this?
Yeah.
So he wasn't suggesting that I bring that up. He was just making a little side comment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we know this and we realize this, why are we still calling it all of these different things, except just doing them in accordance with their own nature?
Mm-hmm. Raising a chicken in accordance with the nature of a chicken,
right?
As Professor McGinley likes to say.
Right. So it is frustrating to me when, I have those realizations, and other people in the field around me also have those realizations. And yet we can't really kind of structure the field in a way where it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, maybe this is a sort of a big picture philosophy question. The place and time where we live does seem to be one in which there's a great deal of philosophical pluralism. Maybe this is the case under modern, post-industrial managerial liberalism, where you can't expect to go into a laboratory full of a society full of entomologists and have a common philosophical vision of the reality behind the science that we're doing. So you'll have different people with more or less conscious, more or less well-developed philosophies, some of which might be compatible, others of which might be radically incompatible. But we're all of us working and doing the sort of surface level project while also, working with, talking about, or not talking about the philosophical suppositions and subtle messages about the world, about reality, about the goodness of being that are beneath them. Of course, that's not the way it has to be, not the way it always has been. But is that, you think, a good diagnosis of the situation today for working scientists?
Yeah, I think so. I do wish that it was a little more accepted to kind of have those issues with the field.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's not really talked about all that often, unless you kind of find someone who has those ideas and you're kind of talking about it in secret, right?
Right. You feel sort of the fugitive philosophical moments, right? But of course, institutional change and large scale cultural change happens at a scale that none of us feel like we can really affect individually. But it's a cumulative work of many people over many decades, and we might find, or you might find, at the end of my career, the middle of your career, in 20 years' time, that things have changed, perhaps for the better, as the way maybe in the past they changed at some point for the worse.
Right.
So we go on doing the little things that we can do with our own crop of 20, 25 students, each semester as we go along. How do you like teaching, by the way?
I love it. Yeah. It is the most fulfilling thing for me. I can have a week where I make amazing research progress and I'm doing great in my classes, but still having that 3-hour lab where I teach my students is the absolute highlight.
Wow.
I really don't think I can imagine myself doing anything else, which I think may surprise a few of my past professors, because I am just naturally a very quiet person. You could probably remember me talking in class maybe a total of 3 times.
Mm. Yeah, you were on the quiet side,
right.
but you wicked smart too.
Thank you. But I just love listening to my students and their ideas and kind of fostering their curiosity. And, it definitely gives me a chance to kind of get out of that quiet shell and really interact with them and hopefully teach them to be better students and better people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's excellent. My own personal story about teaching was my very first class I taught. I remember this. It was the spring of 2000. If you can think what it would be like to be back that far. And I remember being terrified that what if I do this and I'm terrible at it or I hate it? It's agonizing. And it worked out okay. Mm-hmm. It worked out well for me. I had my career in front of me there, but it did feel like stepping into that classroom for the first time on the first day really feels like, it's a moment of truth.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I remember I had peer tutored in undergrad and did a lab teaching assistant thing in organic chemistry, but the professor was there the whole time. We were just helping if students had questions. My first day that I was teaching class last semester, I walked into my classroom early to get all set up and write on my board and everything. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And then all of my kids came in and sat down and were staring at me. You just have that moment of, what have I gotten myself into? Mm-hmm. Now I have these 25 students who are depending on me to hopefully give them some knowledge that they need as a baseline for the rest of their career as scientists in an introductory class. So it was very shocking at first to be in that position, but it's definitely such an honor to be able to help them learn.
Yeah. Well, it's another one of those cases where it really helps to have models to imitate. Right. And good teachers that you can remember, okay, I just need to do what I remember Dr. Miller doing or whoever it is that I'm thinking of. So let me bring us to a close by asking you the question of the show, which is, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's in the position that you were maybe 3 or 4 years ago, or maybe, 2-3 years ago, thinking about whether to add philosophy as a second major or to even just to pursue it because it's an interest? Is it worth the risk? What sort of person is it worth the risk for? What's the potential risk and payoff? What does the answer to that question look like to you now?
It's definitely worth it. Even if you just find yourself in a position where you start to think about it, that means that some sort of seed has been planted in your mind and you have that curiosity and you have that desire to learn. I think it's always worth going after that. For me, it was a little difficult just having the double major. Classes didn't always, schedule the way that I wanted them to.
Were you the one where we had to do that odd schedule thing because of the that's personal between you and I, but I remember one particular class where we had a scheduling nightmare that we had to work through together to get you through the class. Yes. So the less said about that, perhaps the better.
And no, not the only class that I had to deal with that.
Wow.
So I definitely had professors that were very accommodating, very gracious with their time in ensuring that I could take their class, which I'm very grateful for. So even though that was difficult, it was very worth it.
Yeah.
So I think all of my semesters after my freshman year were overloaded in credits.
Oh, wow.
Anywhere between 17 and 19 credits a semester.
Oh my gosh.
But I definitely wouldn't change that. So I feel like I've learned so much. And it definitely instilled some discipline in me to be able to now go on into a more vigorous academic program.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear that you're seeing some relevance in what you're carrying forward from philosophy. People sort of worry when they're thinking about it as a side pursuit that it's a bit like stamp collecting or something. It's to be my hobby that I do on the side on the weekends or in the evenings when I have time for me, but it won't really affect what I'm doing with the rest of my life. And it sounds like your experience is quite the opposite.
Yeah, I definitely had friends where I was telling them I was picking up this major in philosophy. They're like, why are you doing that? What are you going to do with that?
Yeah, everybody gets that question.
Right. Luckily, I didn't get that from my family, which had actually surprised me. I guess they figured I either had some sort of plan or they just didn't want to question it and just left me alone. But I would always tell my friends, it's not just Aristotle that I have in my back pocket or, being able to read Heidegger, which I still can't really do.
I won't tell Dr. Hersey.
Yeah. But just those other skills that you learn and, really having this wholeness, I think, come into your life from being able to answer really hard questions about life and being. Yeah.
That's fantastic. It's great to hear your story. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm really anxious to share with people and let people like you share with the audience. So that's a good place for us to conclude. My guest today on Life After Philosophy has been Makala Harrison, a 2024 graduate of Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and a master's degree student in entomology. Makala, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.